As a service is as much as you want, whenever you want it, at a fixed fee, pay as you use. You use more, you pay more. Your business is doing well, so you're using more cooling, okay, you pay more. Or your business isn't doing so well, you're using less cooling, you use less. So we work with hotels, so their costs really align to their revenue.
Welcome to today's episode of the Product as a Service Champions podcast, aiming to eliminate the sense of being alone when navigating the wild product as a service landscape. I'm your host, Yann Toutant, and today we are diving into the world of cooling as a service. Our guest is David Mackerness, a leader in the industry and a defender of carbon-free cooling. So thank you, David, for joining us today. We are very pleased to have you on the podcast. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So thanks very much for having me. So I've been working at Kaer for about 15 years, which was an energy efficient cooling business. So they started off in distribution of cooling equipment and then became a turnkey contractor for cooling systems for commercial buildings and industrial buildings. And then we transitioned to cooling as a service about a decade ago, so just over 10 years ago now. So I've been with them looking after the development of the CaaS product, implementing it throughout our portfolio, and now I look after our existing customers that are on the cooling as a service platform, and then also help develop some of the technology and software that we use to serve them as well.
Thanks, David. I think it's a great opening because there's a lot we can discuss about what you just said. My first question is, you said a decade ago you made the strategic shift to transition from selling cooling infrastructure to offering cooling as a service. And for our audience, there's always this question: what prompted the transition, and what has made you make this decision to pivot from a transactional business to a subscription business?
So for us, it was really a natural progression. So from representing products to being sort of like a turnkey contractor or a systems integrator, and then moving to as a service. And essentially the reason we made that transition was because we found that customers were asking for things that we weren't selling. And we ended up talking about energy efficiency and talking about technology, but actually customers didn't want that. Building owners want to focus on their business, and they don't really, although it's important for them to have cooling to run their business, it's not a strategic focus for them. It's not core to what they do. So we were having conversations around equipment and technology and energy consumption. And although that was sort of somewhat relevant to our customers, they just said, look, I want 24 degrees in my space, or I want different temperatures for my data center or for my educational facility or for my hospital. So we were having a different conversation to what they were asking for. And so we said, well, instead of selling cooling equipment, or instead of selling energy savings, which I think is where a lot of the market is now, energy efficiency and performance contracts, we said, why don't we just sell the output? So it kind of came from what customers were asking us for, and then we built a as a service offering which fulfilled that. So we said, all right, we'll sell you 24 degrees. We'll take care of all the technology. We'll take care of all the infrastructure. We will pay that the utilities that the cooling system uses to provide you that cooling. So it really just simplified the conversation with our customer. There was no performance contracts. There was no administration. It was just, you sell the cooling just like you would sell electricity or sell water. So it's a natural progression for us really, but driven by the customer.
Yeah, I love what you say, David, and we had discussions already in the past together on this matter. It's really about selling an outcome. It's the performance that you offer, and not the product and the infrastructure itself. It's as simple as it sounds. 24 degrees in your building. That's your commitment.
Yeah, and I think we kind of had this. There was this real conflict, which was every single one of our customers wanted low carbon or no carbon cooling. There's also, it is a reality. You can have low carbon and no carbon cooling. But then the question is if everyone wants it, and if it's possible to have it, what is the barrier? What is stopping most building owners taking this step? And we did a survey with building stakeholders, and we asked them the question, if it's possible, what's stopping you? And usually you give two options. One is the technology or the know-how is available or not available, and the other is cost. Everyone talks about cost when you talk about green buildings, but we actually we actually put a third option there for them, which was it's too complicated. And about 10 to 15% of people said the technology is not available. About a third said that it's the cost. And over half of the applicants, respondents basically said it's just too complicated. We know it's possible, it's just too hard. And so we said, well, okay, well, if we offer it as a service, we get rid of that main barrier. As a service also happens to get over the cost barrier because it's a pay-as-you-use service. So it kind of addresses the two main things. But I think as an industry, we're all talking about technology. We're all talking about chillers and cooling towers and pumps and systems and software. And there's so many, products on the market now that are these black boxes that plug into building control systems and offer energy savings. But actually, that's only a small percent of the problem, right? It's only less than 10, 15% of the problem. You need to address that it's just too complicated. So, we said, well, take your phone out and look at all the things you have on your phone because it's simple. You have Spotify, you have Netflix, you have your news service, you have Facebook, all of these things are as a service offerings, and they're just so convenient. So essentially we said, why don't we make low carbon cooling convenient? And then that's why we sort of transitioned to it.
And you did. Well, I'm tempted to ask. Of course, you spent 10 years implementing. You started 10 years ago, and so we are talking about 2013, 2014. Cooling as a service did not exist even as a term at the time. Could you share one or two challenges you had to overcome when implementing the model?
So I think the main challenge we had is that you're taking a traditionally a CAPEX-heavy business with a very long life cycle, like a 15, 20-year life cycle of that equipment that you're installing, and you're turning that into one bucket of pricing. So there's no CAPEX budget and OPEX budget. There's purely a dollar per ton hour rate that you're providing. So I think you're disrupting the industry by offering something in a very different way. And usually it crosses two buckets, right? The person who's in charge of CAPEX is not necessarily the person who's in charge of OPEX, and they both have varying priorities. So it really was trying to explain that to our customers, and then also figure out a way to essentially work with our customers to figure out if it was financially viable or not. So, if I say to you, cooling in your building is 50 cents per refrigerant ton hour, what does that mean? How much does that cost per month or per year? So it was really a lot of education around the model and the pricing. And we overcame that by not focusing specifically on buildings that would benefit from CaaS, but focusing on customers who were receptive to CaaS. So our portfolio was very sporadic as we grew. So there was shopping malls, there was offices, there was education, there was data centers, there was pharmaceutical, food production. And the reason it was such a splattered approach is because the people who worked in those specific businesses were receptive to outsourcing and doing things differently, and put very high priorities on ESG metrics and sustainability. So it allowed us to sort of have very widespread and actually prove the model in lots of different industries. Whereas actually, if you were just going for impact, you would say go for data centers and hotels because huge utilization and big consumption of cooling. So you should focus on there for the biggest impact. But yeah, we focused on the people as opposed to necessarily the business.
Yeah, so you choose your go-to-market has to choose a certain type of persona where the use case was obvious. And what I hear what you say, David, is also the challenge of if you're used to sell, in your case, cooling infrastructure, you had to change the people you talk to in the organizations. You were not able to, or correct me if I'm wrong, but from experience, we see that when you start to offer product as a service, you change persona at your customers. That's what you mean.
Yeah. So I mean, cooling traditionally was a decision for the facilities team or the technology team. Now it's a strategic decision. It's not a technology decision. Should you as a business be trying to do this yourself, or should you be outsourcing it? So therefore, the people you're talking with are CFO level, CEO level, operations manager level, but also people that are looking at essentially how to change the strategic direction of their business. So the way that we we share with them is really it's how you can have a competitive advantage in what you do by using cooling as a service to support your operations. So yeah, it's very different, the people that you speak with, and also the messaging that's important, right? So we used to talk about energy efficiency. We don't talk about that at all anymore. We don't promise it. We don't guarantee it. We talk about outsourcing. We talk about uptime. We talk about software and SLAs and management of that. So it's a very different conversation.
Of course, yeah, definitely. And what about the sales force that you have empowered to sell the model? Because what we see also in a lot of as a service transition is that the existing sales force is not always ready to start selling performance and outcome versus selling specs. Did you use the same sales force? Did you have a different channel? Could you share that?
Yeah, so we have the same sales force we've had for a decade. So the same people are with us.
Congrats.
I think in terms, thanks. In terms of the bringing them along on that journey, I think it was almost led by our sales team that we're asking to sell things differently because, you know, they're out there seeing the customers every day. They're listening to them and they're saying, look, this is what people are looking for. Now, we didn't have a name for it. Like you said, cooling as a service didn't exist in 2013 when we started it. But they could come back to the management and say, look, this is what people are looking for. Let's start building something. And we built it internally with our strategy team and our sales team and our operations team as well. So I think they were very receptive to the idea of trying something different. I think as we grew in scale, they saw the impact that they were having in terms of carbon emissions and ESG metrics more with CaaS than the traditional way of operating. But at the same time, you have to have incentive structures in place. You have to have training in place to make sure to help that team move over to the new business model. But I think once they're, you don't want resistance to move to do something. I mean, if it's seen as easier to sell a product than to sell a service, then you will have resistance in your sales team. I think because ours was developed with our sales team, we didn't have that particular issue. But also, you know, that same question goes to customers as well. So if you offer the old way of doing things and you offer as a service, if you give those two options, it's very easy to fall back to the old way because it's known and it's not so, it doesn't seem so scary. But at the beginning, we were selling both, you know, the turnkey approach and the CaaS approach. And very quickly, you know, after 2 or 3 years, we said, right, it's CaaS or nothing. And that was difficult for the first few years. In fact, some customers said, no, it's okay. If you don't sell the traditional model, then we can't invite you to tender for this project. And we say, okay, fine, we'll continue to tender for CaaS projects. That's changed a little now. I think many more people are receptive to the model. But 5 years ago, that was very tough. But that was, you know, it's our strategic direction as a business. And our CEO down from, you know, the top to the bottom said, look, it's CaaS or nothing.
Wow, that's an extremely bold decision to dare to cut the line with the existing model and go only for as a service. Congrats, that's a serious.
So we didn't do it so quickly. So we started CaaS in 2013. It was actually 2018 where we said, right, it's just CaaS. So for 5 years there in the middle, we did both.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that was the best decision we ever made, was to really go 100% into it, because then you're just so focused towards growing that CaaS portfolio.
There are so many organizations that have the difficulty to make this decision, and you said that's the best decision we've made.
So I mean that's why I think there is a real space for any as a service offering. So not just cooling, but anyone. So you have your customers on one side, and then you have your big legacy firms on the other side, the big MNCs. And I think there's, they will struggle the most to make this shift because of all that history and legacy. If you have those smaller players in the middle, the SMEs, they're the ones who can really innovate, I think, in this space. If you look at mobility as a service, the car as a service operators, like the ride hailing guys like Lyft or Uber or Grab, these are not, it's not Toyota and Mercedes and Volkswagen that did it. They're providing the cars and the products, but there was these innovative companies that came in the middle to allow that to happen. So I think there's a real space for companies to come in and fill that gap, because I think there's a role for the manufacturers to play, and there's a role for the customers to play, and there's this bridge in the middle. that needs to be addressed.
That's a call to the audience. There is space.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd like to address a topic with you, David. It's the data-driven insights that are instrumental in optimizing your service with your customers. Can you explain how you use data and maybe AI, we said it, the buzzword, to enhance your offers?
Sure. So I think it falls under a few different categories. On the very start of that journey, you've got data capture, and you've got to make sure that that's accurate 100% of the time, minute by minute. So a huge emphasis on all these sensors. We have hundreds of thousands of sensors that have to be managed, and I think that's the part that people forget. It's not the sexy part. It's not the interesting part. It's just the sensors have to be in the right place. They have to be verified and they have to be accurate all the time. So we have a huge team that looks after basically data quality, data capture and data quality. Then you have to make that available to either your internal systems and technologies. So we have a operating system which takes that then helps us operate the cooling systems more efficiently and reliably, but then also making that available to customers in a relevant way. So, that those thousands of data points, are not relevant for most of your customers, but you need to build technology that allows you to share that with them in a meaningful way. So our team will use maybe 99% of that data. Our customers will use the 1% that matters to them. What is the temperature in my amphitheater right now? What's the humidity right now? What was it last month at 3 p.m.? Because I've just got a complaint and I want to know what those conditions are. So I think, you have to make sure you don't build technology just for yourself. And I think more and more we're seeing it as being built for our customers. But you need to make sure you portray it in a relevant way. I mean, otherwise you're just capturing data for the sake of it and you're not actually using it. So our operations software will use that data to optimize systems and give us insights. So that'll tell us when we need to do service and maintenance. So moving from reactive to proactive service and maintenance. I think a lot of people are doing that now and have been doing for a while. But then really focusing on what can you build for your customers that gives them trust in what you're doing, that gives them confidence in their cooling system, that does ESG reporting for them. So we can now build integrations from our data capture and our systems into their ESG reporting, dashboards or reporting frameworks. We're starting to build those now. So I think that's just keep in mind what you're doing it for. But yeah, data capture is super important for us.
Yeah, thanks for being so clear on that, because it's true that we see a lot of as a service models where data collection is extremely important, but also data distribution to the different players of the ecosystem, being first the customer, of course, yourself, your technical team, and maybe other players that you use. And that's the next question I have for you, David. It's about collaboration. Are there any complementary products or services within your ecosystem that you consider integrating in your offer to create more value for your customers? Do you deliver everything yourself, or do you team up with other players?
So we rely, of course, very heavily on the technology providers. And I said, there's a space for them and a role for them, and then there's a space for the as a service companies. They are extremely important in terms of their pipelines of what they're building and developing and rolling out. Also, some of our service and maintenance goes back to the big manufacturers. So we get a huge amount of support from all of them. We are very clear that we are product agnostic. So whatever is most beneficial for that particular customer in that particular building. And I think that's one of the issues that technology providers have. The reason they can't solve this problem is because what works in a data center in Singapore is not going to work in a school in Finland. You can't have a one size fits all model. But as a service provider, it is. The data center in Singapore asks for what they want. The school in Finland asks for what they want, and we can put together the technology and the infrastructure that allows them to have that. So actually, you can have a common offering as a service, but not from a technology perspective. So we rely a lot on them and work with them. We do, depending on the market, we do all the design and installations ourselves. We do work with contractors to help us build the systems, and then all the operations is done by us. But we're always looking at software that can help us do it better. So we have our internal control system. We built our own AI optimization system, and we built our own customer platform. But if there are, other products out there which we can add on to our offering, that's very helpful. So as an example, we had an issue with one of our customers. We couldn't get the granular space conditions. There were so many different spaces in this building, and you couldn't just do it from the equipment level. So what we did is we worked with a company that has these tiny battery operated sensors for temperature and humidity. And we just stuck them all over the spaces. And then we integrated that into our customer experience platform so that our customers can see, okay, what's the exact temperature and humidity down to the granular space level. So always looking for technology providers that can help us give a better level of service to our customers.
The importance of the ecosystem and working as a team to provide the outcome is indeed key. And of course, you mentioned the aspect of carbon neutrality. What I would say what resonates with me is the aspect of circularity in general. I understand that you remain the owner of the assets that are being provided at the customers. We know that cooling systems have a lot of copper, for example, integrated in it. So when the equipment reaches the end of life, did you organize a second life strategy for the equipment? Do you have a specific approach to recycle or repurpose them? What do you do basically of the equipment when they are collected back from your customers?
So if I'm totally honest with you, when we started this, we got a lot of interest from the circular economy people who were essentially saying, this is extremely circular, and they wanted to talk to me about what we were doing. And I didn't understand why, because it was still very linear on a project by project basis. You're still installing the equipment, using it, and then figuring out how to recycle it or repurpose it as best as possible at the end of that life cycle. So it still seemed to me quite linear, although there were obviously benefits in extending the life cycle, etc. But once you move to a portfolio approach, not just a building by building approach, then everything changes. So we have a lot of experience now in moving equipment around. So people see cooling equipment as tied to a building. So once you design the cooling system in that building, it's going to be like that for the next 15, 20 years. It doesn't have to be. We design now very modularly, and we have multiple examples where we take cooling equipment out of buildings and move it into other ones. So let me give you an example. So we had a data center which had 4 chillers on its roof, and because their consumption went up, their business was doing well, they needed more capacity. So what they would do in the old world is they would scrap those 4 chillers and then buy new ones and put them on, and then let's see what happens to those old chillers. What we did is we could replace those chillers, but we would take the ones that were from the data center and we would put them into other projects. So, a 5 or 6 year old chiller is still very efficient and still works very well. We could move it across. We've also had cases where we have buildings which have very old cooling systems, which are reliable, but not energy efficient. So it makes sense to replace them. But those old reliable machines, they shouldn't be thrown away. They can actually be used as standby. So in cooling, most cooling systems will have what we call an N+1 infrastructure. So if any one big piece of equipment fails, there is a backup. So you need these backup standby machines, which are there, but they never run. So what we could do is we could take these old machines and we use them as standby. So in an emergency, we can use them because they're super reliable, but we don't run them because they're not that efficient. So instead of throwing away a 17-year-old machine, we can now extend the life to 20, 25 years. And we're doing that across a few different sites. So I think that's where you can, the portfolio approach allows you to be a bit more plug and play, and you can extend the life. But also that's where we also rely heavily on the vendors and the technology providers. How can we make sure that, if you do have a chiller that's totally gone, how can you recover all the refrigerant? How can you use low GWP refrigerant to start with? And then how do you recycle as much of that as much as possible? So that's where we would rely on partners as opposed to doing that ourselves.
Yeah, but what you mentioned, David, is music to my ears, because this idea of having the technology, the device itself being disconnected from the user because it's here for an outcome, for a performance, and if it's not delivering the performance for this specific user, it can deliver the performance for another user. And this is a big step, and I understand that it's possible only when you have a portfolio approach. Meaning
I
you
think
need
this
to have a certain just meaning you need to have a certain install base to be able to start playing with repurposing some equipment. Am I correct?
Yep. And I think also you need to have a business model that really embraces that. So, if you're installing, this is millions of dollars worth of equipment in a building. If you're installing that, you need to make sure you get your revenue from it. So you're going to have things like minimums and penalties if you don't have consumption. At Kaer, we don't have any of that. If you use less, you pay less. And the reason that is because if your consumption drops, we can take equipment out. It's not that old mentality of, the chiller is for life. If that was fit for purpose, because what you do is when you're designing it, you put in some safety buffer, you assume the load is going to increase, you assume the hottest day of the year, you assume it's a full mall, and you build for that. So there's a lot of underutilization of equipment. We kind of don't have that issue because we can move it around. So we'll have customers where we're having conversations with them today about how do I reduce my consumption? Now, if I had chillers that were locked into that building, it would be hard to have that conversation because you're basically saying, I've got this CapEx and I can't get my revenue. But if the consumption goes down, I take that chiller out. So therefore, it's not assigned to that project anymore. So it's not a problem for me. As long as the cooling system is fit for purpose, it's good for the customer and it's good for the provider. So you have to have that, I think, modular approach so you can work with customers to reduce consumption too.
Do I understand that you have 100% flexibility policy on your contract?
100% flexibility, you mean?
I mean, there's no commitment in terms of specific usage volume, and then if the usage drops, there is no minimum payment to be fulfilled by the customer.
Yep. So in terms of going up, as long as we have the space and the electrical capacity that goes to the building to deliver it, then sure, it can go up. It's infinite. However how much space you can give us. In terms of going down, it can go to zero. If it goes to zero, then you pay zero. Now, of course, there's obviously issues. If your business is using no cooling, then there's probably that signals a larger issue. But yes, exactly right. It's totally pay as you use.
Wow, that's that as a service 2.0. What you're describing now.
but I think
you can do it because go on.
This is the issue with moving to as a service. It's pretty simple when you're talking about Adobe or you're talking about Microsoft. Software as a service is easier. But when you start talking about big infrastructure, that's where I think providers start getting nervous. What if they don't have the utilization? So they start putting in clauses in contracts which will lock in customers or penalize customers for using less or things like this. But that ruins the model. That's not as a service anymore. As a service is as much as you want, whenever you want it, at a fixed fee, pay as you use. You use more, you pay more. Your business is doing well, so you're using more cooling. Okay, you pay more. Or your business isn't doing so well, you're using less cooling, you use less. So we work with hotels, so their costs really align to their revenue. But that's the beauty of the model. So I mean, I think that would be a big piece of advice or an ask to anyone moving into as a service is really try and stay true to the principles of what the model is. And don't try and put customer risk on, or risk onto your customers. Try and keep it as your own business.
That's you have anticipated my closing question because unfortunately it's time to close our conversation, and that's the advice you would give, David, to someone who is into scaling their as a service offer. What would you tell them? What would be the main advice you would like to share as a conclusion to our discussion?
So I think is if anyone's looking whether they should move into the as a service model or not, it can be painful. The bigger the company that you're working with, the harder it can be. But I think it's definitely the way forward. And as a service disrupts every industry that we've seen. We did a study of the top 50 most disruptive companies in the world. We did it about 8 years ago. And like 90% of them are as a service businesses. Like it disrupts every industry that it goes into. And grows very quickly. So I think I would highly recommend going into it if you're not. And as a customers, I would highly recommend, procuring via as a service as opposed to procuring technology. In terms of how to scale it, I think really staying true to the model, going all in and not offering alternatives, just really offering as a service only, is definitely helped us accelerate our growth. But when you do that, really focus on the technology that you're building and how that helps your customers. I think there's a lot of as a service offerings where you focus too much on the product itself as opposed to the outcome. Although you're selling the outcome, you still focus on the product. And we had a lot more traction and receptivity when we just simplified all of the data, simplified all the technology into, it's 24 degrees whenever you want it, wherever you want it. And here's an app on your phone so you can see your consumption, you can see your carbon metrics, you can see your sustainability metrics, you can report that to your stakeholders. You can simplify a lot of things. And I think that's the biggest reason why people want as a service solutions. It's because it's just simple.
Great conclusion, David. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today, and for the audience to be inspired by your as a service journey and the bold decisions that you've made to make it happen. It's a true pleasure always to have discussions with you, David, and to have you today on the Product as a Service Champion podcast. So thank you very much. And one last question, David. Where can we find you?
So you can find us at Kaer.com, Kaer.com, and also follow us on our LinkedIn page as well, where we try and do a lot more on articles on general as a service offerings. And also I would point anyone to the SET Alliance, setalliance.org, which is a group of an organization which is run by BASE out of Switzerland, essentially giving tools and information and education around how you can servitize anything. So cooling, heating, lighting, all those things. So that's a great place to go as well.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, David. Thank you so much one more time for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yann. It's good to be with you.